Today, we're going to dive into one of history's most unlikely stories. How did this tiny kingdom, just tucked away on the edge of Europe, somehow manage to launch a global empire that would change the world forever? Well, the answer involves a terrifying sea, a revolutionary ship, and a king who was either the luckiest man alive or maybe the most ruthless. So, let's picture Portugal in the early 15th century. It's this little sliver of land right on the very edge of what they considered the known world. To the east, you've got powerful rivals. To the west, well, to the west, there's nothing but the vast, terrifying, and completely uncharted Atlantic Ocean. For most of Europe, this was basically the end of the line. But for Portugal, it was about to become a highway to the rest of the planet.
It's a huge question, right? Because before they could even think about an empire, they had a massive, seemingly impossible problem to solve right on their own doorstep. And we're not talking about just any problem. This was like a fundamental law of nature, something that had trapped sailors for centuries, and pretty much made any exploration south a suicide mission.
Okay, so here's the deal. The winds and the currents along the African coast, they were fantastic. If you wanted to sail south, they would just push your ship down the coastline. Super easy. But that same wind and that same current made getting back home, north to Portugal, practically impossible. You were essentially buying a one-way ticket straight into the unknown. And the psychological barrier was maybe even worse than the physical one. There was this spot on the map called Cape Bojador. Now, to sailors at the time, this wasn't just some landmark. It was the point of no return. The myths talked about sea monsters, waters that literally boiled, and a land with no people, no water, nothing. For years, ship after ship just turned back, absolutely terrified of this sea of terror. So how do you solve a problem that seems impossible? Well, you invent an impossible solution. And that solution, the first real hero of our story, was this revolutionary piece of technology. And that's when the caravel shows up. Now, this wasn't just a slightly better version of an old design. No, this was a purpose-built discovery machine. It was engineered by the Portuguese specifically to beat the challenges of the African coast. What's so cool is how all these little innovations worked together. It had a shallow draft, which meant it could get super close to unknown shores without getting stuck. It was small and agile, perfect for dodging weird coastal hazards. But the secret weapon, the absolute game changer, was its triangular lateen sails. See, unlike the big square sails everyone else was using, these let the caravel zigzag into the wind. That one-way ticket south, the caravel just ripped it right up. So with all this combined, it could hug the coast, it could sail up rivers, and it could handle the open ocean. But most importantly, it could always get home. This ship was the key that unlocked the door to the rest of the world. It completely shifted maritime power away from the Mediterranean and out into the vast Atlantic. But a key is pretty useless until someone decides to turn it. And that brings us to the second piece of the puzzle, the second catalyst for this explosion of discovery, an incredibly ambitious and maybe even more incredibly lucky monarch. This guy, Manuel I, was never, ever supposed to be king. He was the ninth child of a duke. The throne was so far out of reach, it wasn't even a thought. They called him the Fortunate. And trust me, when you see how he got the crown, you'll realize that's one of history's biggest understatements. Just look at this chain of events. It's almost unbelievable. First, in 1484, the king at the time, John II, personally stabs Manuel's older brother to death over some conspiracy plot. So that's one obstacle gone. Then, a few years later, the king's only legitimate son, his direct heir, dies in a freak horse riding accident. Suddenly, there's no one left. The dying King John has no choice but to name his cousin Manuel, the brother of the man he personally killed, as the next king of Portugal. Fortune doesn't get much darker or more convenient than that. So now you have this perfect storm, right? The world's most advanced exploration ship, the Caravel, is now in the hands of a new king who is wildly ambitious and apparently has unbelievable luck. What happens next is just a whirlwind. The speed of their expansion is just staggering. Within 3 years of Manuel taking the throne, Vasco da Gama sails all the way around Africa to India. Bam! He opens a direct sea route for the spice trade, completely bypassing the old land routes. Just 2 years after that, another explorer, Pedro Alvarez Cabral, gets blown off course and lands in Brazil, claiming a whole new continent for Portugal. Then they just move with incredible speed, capturing these key trading hubs like Goa and India and Malacca and what's now Malaysia. They effectively seize control of the entire Indian Ocean trade network, a whole global empire built in a little more than a decade.
And the result of all this rapid conquest? Unimaginable wealth. They had a monopoly on the incredibly valuable spice trade. We're talking pepper, cloves, cinnamon. And that, combined with all the resources from the new colonies, just poured into Lisbon. This fire hose of money turned Portugal from this little country on the edge of things into a global superpower, and it made King Manuel I the richest and, you could argue, the most powerful monarch in all of Europe.
And his official title says it all. This wasn't just the king of a small European nation anymore. He literally saw himself as the lord of a global commercial empire, one that stretched all the way from Africa to Asia. This title is just pure, unfiltered ambition, written down as royal policy.
But this golden age, this whole thing funded by all this incredible new wealth, it came at a terrible, terrible cost. The story of this fortunate king has a much, much darker side.
So on one hand, yeah, Manuel used his immense riches to become a great patron of the arts. He financed these magnificent buildings and even created a unique Portuguese architectural style that we now call Manueline. But on the other hand, his reign was just marked by brutal religious intolerance. He ordered that all Jews in Portugal had to convert to Christianity or leave, and then he had them forcibly baptized anyway. He expelled Muslims, and during the horrific Lisbon massacre of 1506, thousands of these so-called new Christians were murdered in the streets.
And that really leaves us with a challenging question, doesn't it? The caravel was a brilliant innovation. It opened up the world, it created immense wealth, it funded a cultural renaissance. But that same power, in the hands of an ambitious king, also enabled conquest and tolerance and just immense suffering. It really forces us to ask, what is the real price we pay for our greatest leaps forward?